Hi, this is Autumn Grace, and this is my passage analysis of chapter 13 from My Name is Asher Lev. So I'll just read through my passage first, and then I'll share my interpretation of the chapter. I remembered my grandfather, the scholar, the recluse, the dweller in the study halls of synagogues and academies of learning. What had transformed him from recluse and scholar to emissary for the Rebbe's father? I wondered how a journeying ancestor could suddenly transform a recluse into a journeying Hassad. Had something inarticulate been handed down from generation to generation that came to life in each individual at a time most appropriate to him? I did not know, but I sensed it as truth. I remembered my father during my mother's illness. He had been as torn by her illness as by his inability to journey for the Reb. I had never been able to understand that torment. Now I wondered if journeying meant to him more than a way of bringing God into the world. Was journeying an unknowing act of atonement? I did not know, but I sensed it as truth. I remember my father and the long, quiet conversations between her and my father when I had been a child. Surely she had sensed the depth of his feelings about his journeys. She too had told me stories about my mythic ancestor. Had she somehow dimly perceived the true nature of my ancestor's journey? Then, perceiving it, had she joined her brother's incompleted tasks to my father's beginning journeys, and thereby, without being fully aware of what she was doing, made possible the continuation of the line of atonement? Had I, with my need to give meaning to paper and canvas rather than to people and events, interpreted an act of eternal atonement? I did not know. Now I thought of my mother, and began to sense something of her years of anguish. Standing between two different ways of giving meaning to the world, and at the same time possessed by her own fears and memories, she had moved now towards me, now towards my father, keeping both worlds of meaning alive. "Paint pretty pictures, Asher," she had said. "Make the world pretty. Show me your good drawings, Asher. Why have you stopped drawing?" She had kept the gift alive during the dead years, and she had kept herself alive by picking up her dead brother's work, and had kept my father alive by enabling him to resume his journeys. Trapped between two realms of meaning, she had straddled both realms, quietly feeding and nurturing them both and herself as well. I could only dimly perceive such an awesome act of will, but I could begin to feel her torment now as she waited by our living room window for both her husband and her son. What did she think of as she stood by the window? Of the phone call that had informed my father of her brother's death? Would she wait now and dread all the rest of her life, now for me, now for my father, now for us both, as she had once waited for me to return home from a museum, as she had once waited for my father to return in a snowstorm? And then later on in the chapter he says, "It was a good painting, but it was incomplete. I had brought something incomplete into the world. Now I felt its incompleteness." "Can you understand what it means for something to be incomplete?" my mother had once asked me. I understood. And so now I'll give my interpretation of chapter 13. So, right off the bat he says, "I remembered," and throughout many of the beginning phrases in this chapter he continually says, "I remembered." And it's just like an anaphora because he's continuing to just use this for what he remembers of like his childhood and growing up of the people that influenced him. Like he uses it just to describe like mostly the people, like his family figures. And then he says what had transformed him from recluse and scholar to emissary for the Reb's father, which is a rhetorical question as he's just wondering all of these things, and he's just trying to come to grips with his past and to understand what it means for his life now and come to a conclusion of what it all means. And then at the end he says, "I did not know, but I sensed it as truth." And you'll see that he also continues to say that in a lot of his phrases, which just shows that he's trying to understand how he came to where he is now and just trying to just understand everything that he is and how he's an artist and how his family lineage has affected him and how he's overall affected his heritage as a whole, as he also continues to say atonement, and is just trying to understand how even he comes into play with how he's shaped his own future and then the futures of others that will come along after him in his family too. And now he discusses his mother and just what he remembers of her and her relationship with his father. And then he also uses another rhetorical question, but then within the rhetorical question, he says, dimly perceived, which he also says once more in the chapter to suggest that he can't fully see or understand anything, and he's only like half in the light, almost like that imagery that he's just like he's 1 foot in the dark, like 1 in the light. Like he doesn't fully understand how he's come to this place, and he uses it to describe how his mother feels, because she often only partially perceived him as a person, as an individual, just growing up in his artwork and artistry. Like, she did not fully understand it. And then he once again says atonement twice in this paragraph, as he uses it really only to portray himself, and just wondering how he impacts his family line, and he knows how everyone in his family now sees him, and how his community envisions what he's done, but he's also wondering how his actions will go into the future, like the repercussions of the future. And then I found it really interesting how at the end of this paragraph he only says, "I did not know." As in the other ones he said, "I did not know, but I sensed it as truth." But this one he only says, "I did not know," as his mind is just still muddled, and what he thought he knew as genuine truth is just slipping, and nothing is really making sense to him anymore, and he's just sort of at a crossroads, and he just can't understand how we came here, how the future will be, just all of that. And then there's a break from the anaphora phrase of "I remembered," and now he discusses his mother, and he only says, "Now I thought," which is contrasting to how he discussed members of his family before, because he says "now I thought" as if he still envisions her this way, as just being in like a constant state of anguish and just worriment and all of that. And it just shows how his mother is almost like a constant unchanging thing in his life. Like, she is still the same way. Other characters are still sort of the same way, but they have still like grown in a way, but he still sees her the same. Like, his mother that would say, paint pretty pictures to him, and she just seems as if she's the same individual, and over the course of his life, she is still the same kind of figure to him. And he continues to discuss his mother, and then the repetition of the phrase "dimly perceived" also comes up once again. And again, it's just him only using it to almost describe himself, and how he can't see at all. Like, he can only see like a little crack of like everything that's occurring, and he does not fully understand it. He doesn't hold back from stating that he does not fully understand how things could be, as this is like comparing himself to his mother, how she didn't understand his art and him as a child, and just was just like so puzzled and bewildered by him. And then he could only dimly perceive how she was like that, how she was almost like the mediator between his father and himself, and how they had such like a clashing between the two of them, and she was just in between them, like kind of like the calm and the storm, trying to man both sides of the argument and everything. And then there's another rhetorical question stated as he describes his mother, as he still remembers her, and just wonders if she's going to be the same as she was, and just be so quizzical and just wondering of everything, like waiting as she always would wait for him. And he compares himself to his father, as she'd now be waiting for him to return, as she always waited for his father to return from his many journeys and all of his journeying through the Reb and all of that. And he also goes like to back to like reflection in a flashback, as he often does throughout this passage, as he recalls the time that she was awaiting his return home from the museum. And then later on in the chapter, he says it was a good painting, but it was incomplete. And he repeats the word incomplete like 4 times throughout this small passage, just to show the impact of the word and what it's had on him, because he does not refrain from explaining that he did not understand what what the word incomplete meant in the past to him, as the phrase is frequently used throughout the book to describe his mother and how she's trying to fulfill her brother's uncompleted work after his death. And he shows that he did not understand what it meant at the time, but it's just a word that has stuck with him, though the meaning wasn't always clear, and he now realized that the impact of the word, and as his mother often said it, and he's experienced it for himself in his painting, what this incompleteness actually is. Like, he understands it, he can resonate with the word because he's finally experienced what the word can mean and what it has. And I feel like it's also just a really good summary of this whole passage from chapter 13, as there's just a lot of incompleteness that's just inside of him right now, as he's wondering about the future and what he's done with his community, and how he's so different and just like an outsider and almost just been ostracized, and he's just so wondering of everything. And though his decision seemed firm, he's now rethinking everything and does not really understand how he came to this place. So he's kind of backpedaling throughout his life to try to come to grips with how all of this came to be and what effect it had on him and will continue to have on him for the rest of his life. So that's my reflection of chapter 13 of My Name is Asher Lev.